Chapter 1. The annual gala of Ruihang Technology gleamed with lights. Crystal chandeliers poured down from the dome, their radiance dancing across 600 round tables. Champagne shimmered with golden bubbles and glass flutes, waiters weaved through the crowd, and delicate pastries on trays were neatly arranged. On every table sat Ruihang's emblem, an upward arrow symbolizing bold progress, steering toward the future. Sabrina stood at the entrance of the banquet hall and glanced down at her place card. In the corner. By the wall. No nameplate on the seat. She smiled, slipped her desk nameplate into her black clutch, and walked alone toward that corner. Her high heels clicked crisply on the marble floor. As she passed the round tables, she could feel gazes settling on her, some curious, some indifferent, some tinged with an ineffable sympathy. Chief Legal Officer. No one in the company knew about her other identity. Julian's wife. The wife he'd been secretly married to for 6 years. The big screen was looping Ruihang's 6-year entrepreneurial journey. The scene opens on a few battered tables in a basement. The walls are mottled, the wiring bare, and the air hangs heavy with the smell of instant noodles and coffee. Julian sits in a corner typing code, she sits at another table, sorting through legal documents. That was their beginning. The scene shifts, moving into an office building, the first round of funding, the second round, the Nasdaq bell about to ring. Every shot is of Julian writing code, Julian meeting investors, Julian giving interviews, Julian waving at press conferences. 6 years. Over 1,000 days and nights. She does not appear in the footage. Sabrina glanced at the screen, her expression calm. Her fingers unconsciously stroked the USB drive in her handbag. Inside it was the audit backdoor she'd left while building the compliance framework, the original records of all related party transactions of Ruihang. She had waited 3 months. In 3 days, she wouldn't have to wait any longer. Chief Legal Officer, this way please. A young girl came over, she was from Ruihang's administration. She wore the standard uniform, her smile polite, but her eyes a little evasive. Sabrina recognized her. 3 months ago, this girl had been an intern, it was Sabrina's signature that had made her permanent. Thank you. Sabrina nodded and followed her toward the corner. As they passed the main table, she saw Julian. He wore a dark gray bespoke suit, his tie tied impeccably. His hair was neatly combed, revealing a smooth forehead. His smile was gentle and confident, the kind that said, everything is under control. Sabrina had seen that smile countless times. In the basement, he held her hand and said, once the company succeeds, I'll give you a grand wedding. During the funding rounds, he draped an arm around her shoulder and said, just wait a little longer, everything will be fine after we go public. He always smiled like that whenever he needed her help. Next to his hand stood a woman. 27 or 28, her long hair swept up to reveal a string of diamond earrings. She wore a dark green evening gown that fell to her ankles, a diamond necklace at her throat that glittered under the lights. Her makeup was flawless, her smile perfect, her bearing effortless. Her hand rested on Julian's arm. Sabrina knew her. Serena. The heiress of Huasheng Group. Julian's hand naturally rested on Serena's waist, giving a light pat. The movement was gentle, casual, as if he had done it many times before. In 6 years, Julian had never made such a gesture toward Sabrina in public. Because he made Sabrina keep their marriage secret. Because he told Sabrina to wait a little longer. Because he promised, after the IPO I'll give Sabrina a grand wedding. Sabrina withdrew her gaze and kept walking forward, as if she hadn't seen anything. Her heartbeat was steady. Her expression was calm. She only mouthed one sentence in her mind, 3 days. At 8 in the evening, the annual party officially began. The lights dimmed, and a spotlight hit the center of the stage. The host stepped up, a well-known financial presenter, his smile practiced. Distinguished guests, friends, good evening. Applause erupted. Tonight, we gather to witness a glorious moment for Ruihang Technology. 6 years ago, Ruihang was still a dream. Tonight, Ruihang is about to list on Nasdaq, becoming the most talked about tech IPO of the year. More applause. Next, let's watch a short film to review Ruihang's entrepreneurial journey. The big screen began to play the video. Scenes of the basement appeared again, followed by the fundraising signing ceremony, the product launch, the team photos. Sabrina sat in the corner, holding a glass of champagne. She stared at the screen, remembering those days. On nights in the basement she sat in a battered chair, revising contracts line by line. Julian sat beside her writing code, occasionally looking up at her with a smile. "Thanks for your hard work, wife." Back then they had nothing, but she felt it was enough. She believed that once the company succeeded, he would give her a proper place by his side. She had waited 6 years. What she finally received was this scene at the annual gala. Next, please welcome the founder and CEO of Ruihang Technology, Mr. Julian, to the stage to deliver his speech. The applause was thunderous. Julian walked onto the stage, the lights converging on him. He stood before the microphone, surveyed the room, and wore a gentle smile. 6 years ago today, Ruihang was still a rickety table in a basement. His voice carried through the speakers across the hall, calm and magnetic. Back then, nobody believed we could make it this far. Investors shook their heads, friends urged us to quit, and even I had my doubts. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the room. But we did it. Along the way, there are so many people to thank. My team, they are my strongest support, my investors, they gave me trust and backing, and... He paused. The big screen changed. Sabrina expected it would be her photo. After all, she was the chief legal officer. After all, she had built the entire compliance framework. After all, she held 12 core patents on trust. But what appeared on the screen was Serena. A photo of Serena holding a little girl. The girl looked about 3, wearing a white dress, smiling sweetly. Julian stood beside them, the 3 of them smiled like a family. The whole room froze. Sabrina sat in the corner, the champagne in her hand suspended in midair. Julian's voice continued, "Serena is the most important person in my life. She stood by me through the hardest times and gave me the greatest support. Today, I want to take this opportunity to announce some good news to everyone." Vanessa walked onto the stage, a microphone in her hand, her smile flawless. She was Julian's assistant, had been standing at the side of the stage, waiting for this moment. Julian and Serena will be getting married right after the bell ringing. Meanwhile, they already have an adorable daughter, who is 3 years old this year. She paused for a moment, her voice rising a few notches. "Let's congratulate them." Applause broke out unevenly. More people were stunned, exchanging glances with one another, whispering. "Isn't the chief legal officer his wife? No way, he's with Huasheng's heiress? What does that make Sabrina? Secretly married? No way." Sabrina sat in the corner, listening to the voices around her, her expression calm. Sabrina didn't fall apart. She didn't cry. She simply lifted her glass and drained it in one gulp. The champagne was cool. As it slid down her throat, Sabrina felt a strange clarity. Sabrina's gaze shifted from calm to something icy. Not despair. It was finally no more pretending. Julian stood on the stage, his smile still perfect. He could feel the oddness from the audience, but he chose to ignore it. He was used to controlling the situation at critical moments, used to diverting attention with a smile and words. "I know, this news may come as a surprise to everyone." His voice remained gentle. "But Serena and my relationship is one of the important reasons Ruihang has made it this far. The support from Huasheng Group has allowed us to focus on our products and technology." He looked out at the audience, his gaze sweeping over one face after another. He did not look at Sabrina. Serena stood beside him, her smile flawless. Her hand looped through his arm, posture effortless. She was used to occasions like this, used to being watched, used to hiding everything behind a smile. In the audience, some began to applaud, some raised their glasses. The atmosphere at the annual meeting slowly recovered. But Sabrina knew that some things had already changed. She stood up, picked up her clutch, and walked toward the exit. No one noticed her leaving. The corridor was long and dimly lit. Sabrina's high heels clicked crisply against the marble floor. She didn't look back or stop. Her mind was a mess, and yet unnervingly clear. 3 months ago, while sorting compliance documents, she found the email exchanges between Julian and Serena. In those emails there were discussions about a daughter, plans for a wedding, and schemes about how to deal with Sabrina. She said nothing. Sabrina spent 3 months systematically going through all the legal papers, the patent stewardship agreements, the company's compliance framework, Huasheng's investment contracts. She discovered that Huasheng had concealed its controlling stake through a multi-layered structure and actually controlled far more of Ruihang's equity than disclosed. Sabrina found the patent transfer agreement falsified by Julian. The signature on that document was not her handwriting at all. Sabrina had waited 3 months. She had been waiting for today. Sabrina. A voice came from behind her. Sabrina stopped and turned around. A man stood in the shadow of the corridor, slender, wearing a dark blue suit with his tie slightly loosened. His face looked severe under the light, but there was something complicated in his eyes. Marcus. A rival from law school. The last time Sabrina saw Marcus was at graduation. Back then, he won the Best Thesis Award, and she won the Best Advocacy Award. They exchanged a glance, neither of them spoke. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked. His voice was quiet, as if testing the waters. Sabrina looked into his eyes. She knew what he was asking. He saw what happened at the annual party. He saw Julian and Serena. He saw the way she sat in the corner. "I'm fine," Sabrina said. Her voice was very calm. Too calm. Marcus frowned. "You don't have to." "Perfect." Sabrina cut him off, a faint smile lifting the corner of her mouth. "Some things don't need to wait any longer." She turned and continued walking. Marcus stood where he was, watching her silhouette vanish at the end of the corridor. For the first time he realized, she wasn't collapsing. She was powering up. Chapter 2. 1 o'clock in the morning, Ruihang Technology headquarters. Only a few lights were still on in the building. A security guard dozed at the front desk, a cleaner pushed a cart down the corridor. When the elevator doors opened, Sabrina stepped out. She was wearing the black dress from the annual gala, her makeup still intact, high heels clicking crisply on the marble floor. She didn't go straight to the CEO's office, she went to her own office first. The office was small but tidy. The bookshelf was filled with legal volumes, and folders were piled on the desk. She walked to the shelf, pulled out a folder, and flipped through a few pages. They were the documents she had compiled 3 months earlier. Emails between Julian and Serena. A birth certificate for a 3-year-old girl, with Julian's name listed in the father's field. The Huasheng Group investment agreement, which included an unpublished supplemental clause. She put the folder back on the bookshelf, picked up her handbag, and walked toward the CEO's office. The CEO's office door was ajar. Sabrina pushed it open and stepped inside. Julian stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking at the city's lights. His silhouette looked a little tired in the glow, but when Sabrina entered, he turned and revealed a gentle smile. "Sabrina." His voice was a little hoarse, as if he'd just been drinking. "You're here." Sabrina said nothing. She sat down on the sofa and looked at him. Julian walked to the coffee table, picked up a bottle of whiskey, and poured 2 glasses. He handed her one, took the other himself, and sat opposite. "I know what happened today was hard for you to accept." His voice was soft, tinged with a certain remorse. "But you have to understand, it was for the company." Sabrina didn't take the glass. She simply looked at him, her expression calm. Huasheng was a strategic investor, Serena was a necessary alliance. Julian continued, Huasheng can give us capital, resources, connections. Without Huasheng, Ruihang wouldn't have made it this far. Our feelings for each other won't change, only the form. Form? Sabrina cut him off, her voice very calm. You didn't even give me the form. 6 years, Julian. Julian fell silent. He looked into Sabrina's eyes and for the first time noticed they were different from before. Previously, her gaze had been gentle, forgiving, as if to say, I understand. Now, Sabrina's gaze was cold. I know this isn't fair to you. Julian sighed, setting down his glass. So, I prepared some compensation. He took a folder from under the coffee table and set it on the table. Sign it, I'll give you a settlement, you leave with dignity. It's better for everyone. Sabrina lowered her head and looked at the document, patent assignment agreement. 12 core patents, transferred from her name to Ruihang Technology. She picked up the agreement and flipped to the last page. In the signature field was a signature. The handwriting looked a lot like hers, but it wasn't. She had never signed this agreement. Sabrina looked at that signature and smiled. The smile was light, as if at a clumsy joke. Julian. She raised her head, her voice terrifyingly calm. Did you really think I knew nothing? Julian frowned. What? 3 months ago. Sabrina stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, turning her back to Julian. The city lights outside glittered, but her gaze held only coldness. I found some interesting things while sorting the compliance documents. She turned around and looked at Julian. Correspondence between Julian and Serena. A birth certificate for a 3-year-old girl with your name listed as the father. In Huasheng Group's investment agreement, there's an undisclosed supplemental clause. Julian's face changed. You. I didn't make a fuss. Sabrina's voice was calm. I spent 3 months systematically combing through every legal document. The patent trust agreements, the company's compliance framework, Huasheng's investment contracts. She walked to the coffee table and picked up that forged agreement. I found something even more interesting. Huasheng, through a 3-tier offshore structure and 6 nominee holders, actually controls a stake in Ruihang far exceeding the 35% disclosed in the prospectus. Julian, do you know what that means? Julian's face went completely pale. There are material misstatements in the prospectus. Sabrina's voice was quiet, but each word was like a knife. Once exposed, the IPO will collapse. She threw the agreement back onto the coffee table. You've been waiting for me to break, waiting for me to sign this agreement, so you could leave with your dignity intact. But what you don't know is... She pointed to the signature on the agreement. This signature is not mine. I had a handwriting expert examine it. The pressure distribution is inconsistent, the signing speed is abnormal. This agreement is forged. And the notarization record? None. Julian, forging legal documents, do you know the consequences? Julian slumped onto the sofa, his face ashen. He looked at Sabrina as if she were a stranger. You knew all along? Yes. Why not? Why didn't you say anything? Sabrina cut him off, her voice still calm. Because I was waiting. She walked to the door, then looked back at him. 3 years ago, you said once the company was stable, you'd give me a title. 2 years ago, you said once the funding was in place, you'd make our relationship public. A year ago, you said once the IPO succeeded, you'd give me a grand wedding. I've been waiting 6 years, Julian. Her eyes were icy, as if looking at a stranger. Now, there's no need to wait any longer. She pushed the door open and walked into the corridor. Sabrina. Julian chased after her, panic in his voice. We can talk. Sabrina stopped and turned back. Her gaze was icy, without a trace of warmth. Bell rings in 3 days. I will make you know who truly holds the lifeline. It's been 6 years, and you've never asked me what I wanted. Now, you don't need to ask." She turned and vanished at the end of the corridor. Julian stood where he was, his legs going weak, feeling true fear for the first time. Sabrina's footsteps faded down the corridor. She did not look back. Her mind was clear. 3 months ago, when she discovered Julian's relationship with Serena, she thought she would collapse. But strangely, she didn't. She only felt a peculiar calm. She spent 3 months compiling all the evidence. The original proxy patent holding agreement, the forensic report on the forged contract, the chain of evidence proving Huasheng's covert holdings. She knew Julian would force her to sign the agreement after the annual meeting. She knew Huasheng would purge the unstable elements before the IPO. She knew she had to wait. Wait until the most critical moment, then strike. Now, the moment had come. Sabrina stepped out of the building, the night wind brushed her cheek. She took out her phone and dialed a number. "Help me find Marcus's contact information." The person on the other end of the line paused. "Marcus? Which Marcus?" "The Marcus from law school 7 years ago who won the Best Thesis Award." "All right, I'll check right away." Sabrina hung up, stood at the building's entrance, and stared up at the night sky. She remembered the graduation ceremony 7 years ago. Marcus stood on the stage, holding a trophy, his gaze severe. She stood below, clutching the Best Advocate Award, and their eyes met for a moment. Back then, she thought they were merely rivals. Now, she needed him. Chapter 3. 2 days before the bell ringing, 9 a.m. Midtown Manhattan, a top-tier law firm. Sabrina pushed open the glass door and stepped into the lobby. The receptionist looked up and wore a professional smile. "Miss Sabrina, Attorney Marcus is already waiting for you in the conference room." "Thank you." Sabrina followed the secretary down the corridor and entered a conference room. When the door opened, Marcus was standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to the door. Hearing the footsteps, he turned around. 7 years. He's changed a little. The lines in his face are harsher, his gaze keener, but that silent, always analyzing you air is exactly the same as during law school. "Sabrina." He gestured for her to sit, then sat opposite her. "I saw you leave on the night of the annual gala." His voice was very calm. "Later I checked Ruihang's prospectus. Some parts are interesting." Sabrina took a folder out of her handbag and pushed it toward him. "Forged patent assignment agreements. Signature handwriting analysis reports. And..." She paused for a moment. "The original proxy holding agreement for the 12 core patents." Marcus opened the file and skimmed through it quickly. His frown deepened. "The signature definitely has issues." He pointed at the appraisal report. "The distribution of pen pressure is inconsistent, the signing speed is abnormal. This agreement is forged, without a doubt." He looked up at Sabrina. "What are you going to do?" "File a supplemental disclosure with the SEC regarding the patent ownership dispute." Sabrina's voice was calm, then, sue in court over the forged agreement. "Do you know what that means?" Marcus put the documents down. "Once it starts, there's no turning back. Ruihang's IPO will be affected, and the value of the patents in your hands will fluctuate. I closed the door 6 years ago and there's no going back." Sabrina looked at him, her gaze steady. "Julian thought I could endure it for a lifetime. But he was wrong. What I could endure was only waiting for the right moment." Marcus looked into her eyes and fell silent for a few seconds. He recalled the graduation ceremony 7 years ago. Back then, she stood on the stage holding the Best Debater Award, her gaze resolute. He knew she was someone who wouldn't give up easily. "All right." He nodded. "I'll help you prepare the materials." That same afternoon, at Ruihang Technology's headquarters. The atmosphere in the conference room was heavy. Julian sat at the far end of the long table, his face ashen. Vanessa stood beside him, holding a notice she had just received. The SEC is asking us to submit additional materials. Vanessa's voice trembled slightly. There's a dispute over patent ownership. Sabrina sued in court. She says the agreement was forged and has requested a forensic examination. Julian sprang to his feet, the chair scraped the floor with a grating sound. How dare she? Julian. A cool, stern voice cut him off. The representative from Huasheng Group sat at the other end of the long table, a man in his 50s wearing a dark gray suit, his expression indifferent. He held a cup of coffee and took a slow sip. Patent issues must be resolved before the bell rings, his voice devoid of feeling. Otherwise, Huasheng will reassess its investment. Julian's face went even paler. I can explain. You'd better be able to. The Huasheng representative stood up and straightened his suit. Huasheng doesn't invest in companies with legal flaws. Do whatever you have to. He pushed the door and left, leaving Julian and Vanessa staring at each other. Public relations. Julian ground his teeth. Contact the media, suppress this. Vanessa nodded and walked away briskly. Julian took out his phone and dialed Sabrina's number. I'm sorry, the number you have dialed has blocked you. He hung up and dialed again. The same result. Julian threw his phone down on the table. Ruihang Technology's PR team sprang into action. They contacted friendly media outlets, trying to suppress coverage of the patent dispute. But Sabrina's chain of evidence was too solid, the press was unwilling to bury such a big story. The next day, the reports began to appear. Ruihang Technology's core patent ownership in doubt, IPO may be affected. Chief Legal Officer sues founder, patent transfer agreement suspected forged. Huasheng Group invests in Ruihang, are there legal risks? Ruihang's stock price expectations began to fall, and investors started to waver. Julian sat in his office, staring at the news on his computer screen, his face ashen. He dialed Serena's number. Julian. Serena's voice was icy. I saw what happened with the patents. Serena, I can explain. You'd better settle this before the bell rings. Serena cut him off. Huasheng will reassess its investment. Do you know what that means? If Ruihang's IPO goes south, Huasheng won't go down with you. The call ended. Julian held his phone, his hand trembling. He remembered 3 years ago, the first time he met Serena. At that time, Huasheng had just invested in Ruihang, and Serena attended the signing ceremony as Huasheng's representative. She wore a black evening gown, her smile flawless. She walked up to him and extended her hand. Julian, pleased to meet you. At that time, he thought it was a perfect marriage of capital. Now, he finally realized he was merely a pawn of Huasheng. Reporters swarmed at the courthouse entrance. Sabrina stepped out of the courthouse doors, with Marcus following behind her. Flashbulbs kept flashing as reporters raised microphones, clamoring to be heard. Miss Sabrina, why are you suing Ruihang Technology? Sabrina stopped and faced the cameras. Her expression was calm, her gaze resolute. The patent transfer agreement is forged. I never signed any transfer agreement, she said clearly. As the nominal holder of 12 core patents, I have the right to protect my legal interests. There's a rumor that you're Mr. Julian's secret wife. Is that true? Sabrina looked at the camera and smiled. The smile was faint, but her eyes were cold. That question, you should ask Mr. Julian. The thing he's best at is making women wait. But I don't want to wait any longer. She turned and walked away, Marcus following behind her. The reporters froze for a few seconds, then went wild, snapping photos. Sabrina slid into the car and stared out the window. Are you okay? Marcus asked. I'm fine. Sabrina's voice was very calm. She remembered the basement 6 years ago. Back then, Julian held her hand and said, when the company succeeds, I'll give you a grand wedding. She believed him. She waited 6 years. Now, she no longer wanted to wait. Chapter 4. The night before the bell ringing, 11 o'clock at night. Uptown Manhattan, Sabrina's apartment. The curtains were drawn tight, leaving only the glow of the computer screen. Sabrina sat at the desk and took the USB drive from her clutch. The silver metal casing flashed with a cold light under the lamp. She plugged in the drive and entered the password. The screen brought up Ruihang Technology's back-end data system, an audit backdoor she had left when building the compliance framework, capable of retrieving all the original records of related party transactions. She opened the folders one by one. Cash flow. Equity holding agreements. Offshore company structures. Her eyes grew colder and colder. Huasheng Group's equity structure was even more complex than she had imagined. Three-tier offshore structure: the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Singapore. 6 nominee holders, 3 individuals, 3 offshore companies. The prospectus states Huasheng Group holds 35% and is the second largest shareholder. But actual data show that Huasheng, through its nominee holders, controls more than 55% of the shares. What does this mean? There are material misstatements in the prospectus. Once exposed, the IPO will collapse. Sabrina stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She had 2 choices. First, expose the corruption. Ruihang will collapse completely, and the patents in her hands will be worth nothing. But Julian and Huasheng will pay. Second, use the scandal as leverage. Force Julian and Huasheng to submit, so she can extract more compensation. But what she wanted was not money. What she wanted was for them to pay. She remembered the basement 6 years ago. At that time, Julian held her hand and said, "Sabrina, you are the most important person to me." She believed him. Now, she understood what that sentence really meant. She was his legal instrument, his nominal holder of patents, a pawn he could discard at any moment. But in her hands, she held Ruihang's lifeline. At 1 in the morning, the doorbell rang. Sabrina stood up and walked to the door. Marcus stood outside. He was wearing a dark trench coat and holding a set of documents. His face looked a little weary, but his eyes were bright. "You missed a clause." He stepped into the apartment and set the documents on the coffee table. Sabrina lowered her head and scanned them quickly. Page 127 of the prospectus, the related party transactions disclosure. Huasheng's related party transactions were not fully disclosed in the prospectus, Marcus said calmly. That violates the SEC's mandatory disclosure requirements. Even if you don't proactively expose it, the SEC has the authority to request additional disclosures during their review. And once those supplements are made, the facts of the false statements can't be hidden. Sabrina looked up and stared at Marcus. "How did you find out?" "When I was reviewing Ruihang's prospectus, I found that Huasheng's list of related parties didn't match the disclosures." Marcus sat down on the sofa. "I did some digging." He paused for a moment. "Sabrina, you don't have to harm yourself. You just need to let the SEC discover these materials." Sabrina looked at him and was silent for a few seconds. Then she smiled. It was a slight smile, but her gaze was resolute. "Thank you. But I don't need leverage. What I want is for them to pay the price." Marcus looked into her eyes and was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. "Then I'll help you make the materials utterly bulletproof." 4 a.m., Huasheng Group headquarters. A lamp burned in the top-floor office. A man in his 50s stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, gazing at the city's lights. His hair was streaked with gray, but his posture was upright and his gaze keen. He was the shadowy head of Huasheng Group, Serena's father. The phone rang. "What?" "The patent lawsuit, it's starting to be reported by the media." The voice on the other end sounded urgent. "Someone is looking into the relationship between Huasheng and Ruihang." The man's expression darkened. Find out. Find out who's behind this. And," he paused, "get the PR team ready. If it can't be contained." He didn't finish the sentence, but the person on the other end of the line already understood. Huasheng Group cannot be dragged into a scandal. If Ruihang's IPO runs into trouble, Huasheng must cut ties. At the same time, at Ruihang Technology headquarters, Julian sat in his office, his face ashen. His phone rang. It was a call from Huasheng. Julian. The Huasheng representative's voice was icy. The patent issue has to be resolved today. Otherwise you can forget about ringing the bell. Huasheng has already sent a PR team, but you'd better deal with Sabrina before this gets out of hand. You know what she has in her hands. The call ended. Julian held the phone, his hand trembling. He dialed Sabrina's number. Sorry, the number you have dialed. He hung up and dialed again. It was the same. He stood up and rushed out of the office. 5 a.m, downstairs at Sabrina's apartment building. Julian stood at the door and rang the bell. No one answered. He took out his phone and sent a text message. Sabrina, can we talk? I'm begging you. I was wrong, No reply. Julian stood in the cold wind, feeling real fear for the first time. He remembered 6 years ago, when he held Sabrina's hand and said, when the company succeeds, I'll give you a grand wedding. He thought she would wait forever. He was wrong. Inside the apartment, Sabrina sat in front of her computer. On the screen were the composed windows for 3 emails. Recipients, the SEC, Financial Daily, the Wall Street Journal. Attachments, the complete chain of evidence on Huasheng Hidden Holdings. She looked at the screen, took a deep breath. Then she clicked send. Chapter 5. Nasdaq, 9 a.m. The hall was ablaze with light, Ruihang Technology's logo flashing on the giant screen. Reporters lifted their cameras, investors held up champagne, and every gaze was fixed on the center of the stage. Julian stood on the stage, his charcoal gray suit impeccably tailored, his smile flawless. Serena linked her arm through his, her dark green gown glinting under the lights. Her smile was equally perfect, as if she had everything under control. In 3 days, they would hold their wedding. Today was the most glorious moment of Julian's life. He walked to the microphone and cleared his throat. 6 years ago, Ruihang was just a battered table in a basement. His voice carried through the speakers across the hall, with a calm magnetism. Back then, no one believed we could make it this far. Investors shook their heads, friends urged us to quit, even I had my doubts. He paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping across the room. But we did it. Applause. Today, Ruihang is about to land on Nasdaq, becoming the year's most watched tech IPO. More applause. Along the way, I have to thank many people. My team, my investors, and... He looked toward Serena. The most important person in my life. Serena smiled, a perfect smile. Julian reached out and pressed the bell button. The whole hall held its breath. The countdown on the big screen, 3, 2, 1. The screen went black suddenly. A second later, a red emergency notice popped up, SEC emergency notice. Due to material misstatements in the prospectus, Ruihang Technology's IPO is suspended immediately. At the same moment, news alerts from 3 major media outlets were sent out simultaneously. Huasheng Group secretly controls Ruihang Technology, prospectus suspected of material misrepresentation. Ruihang Technology's core patent ownership dispute, founder suspected of forging agreements. Huasheng Group under investigation, Ruihang's IPO process suspended. Julian's hand hung suspended in midair. The bell did not ring. Replacing them were the hurried footsteps of the exchange staff and the reporters' frantic questions. Mr. Julian, how do you respond to the allegations of false statements? Ms. Sabrina has sued you for forging the patent transfer agreement. Are these claims true? Did you know that Huasheng Group effectively controls Ruihang through covert holdings? Julian stood on the stage, his face ashen. He looked toward Serena. Serena withdrew her arm, putting distance between them. Her smile vanished, replaced by a kind of cold indifference. Huasheng will hold you accountable. Her voice was soft, but loud enough for Julian to hear. Julian, you'd better figure it out yourself. She turned and walked toward the backstage. Reporters swarmed forward, surrounding her in a tight circle. Miss Serena, was Huasheng Group aware of this? Is your relationship with Mr. Julian connected to any transfer of benefits? Serena didn't answer. With a sallow face she shoved past the reporters and vanished into the crowd. Julian stood on the stage, watching the headlines scroll across the big screen. Ruihang stock price is expected to plunge. Huasheng Group was placed under formal investigation. 6 years of dreams collapsed at their highest point. Ruihang Technology headquarters was in chaos. Employees gathered around computers, watching the news. Some began packing their things, some started making calls, and others stood in the corridors, bewildered. Vanessa had vanished without a trace. The executives were all resigning one after another. When Julian returned to the company, most of the office was already empty. He walked into the CEO's office and collapsed into the chair. The forged patent assignment agreement still lay on the table. He took out his phone and dialed Sabrina's number. This time, Sabrina answered. Sabrina. Julian's voice was hoarse. Please, withdraw the complaint. We can start over. Start over? Sabrina's voice came through the phone, terrifyingly calm. Julian, do you know why I waited 3 months? Because I was waiting for a moment. Make you lose everything when you are closest to success. Just like you made me lose everything when I was closest to happiness. Julian's hand holding the phone trembled. Sabrina, I was wrong. 6 years. Sabrina interrupted him, you never once asked what I wanted. Now, you don't need to ask. The phone clicked off. Julian knelt on the floor, his phone slipping onto the carpet. He stared out the window, at the city's skyline. 6 years ago, he stood in the basement and told Sabrina, when the company succeeds, I'll give you a grand wedding. Today, he stood on the Nasdaq stage and watched his dream collapse. And the woman he had betrayed for 6 years never showed up, from beginning to end. On the other side of the city, Sabrina stood by the window of her apartment. She looked out the window, gazing at the city's skyline. Her phone showed a missed call and a text from Julian. She didn't reply. She simply stood there and took a deep breath. It wasn't liberation. It was a kind of heavy calm. 6 years. She finally didn't have to wait anymore. Chapter 6. 3 months later. Ruihang Technology was acquired, and Julian was out. Huasheng Group was heavily fined for false statements, and Serena's family's power suffered a severe blow. Media commentary: the collapse of a capital marriage began with a woman who was underestimated. New York State Supreme Court. Sabrina stepped out of the doors, a judgment in her hand. Sunlight fell on her shoulders, she squinted and looked up at the sky. The handwriting on the judgment was clear, ownership of the patent was confirmed to belong to Sabrina, and the forged agreements were declared invalid. 12 key patents, worth hundreds of millions. Now, they were all hers. She didn't smile, she simply took a deep breath and looked up at the sky. She had finally taken back what rightfully belonged to her. The buyer of Ruihang Technology came calling, presenting a patent license agreement. Sabrina glanced at the figures and signed. She didn't need control, didn't need management, she only needed one thing: financial independence. Then she handed in her resignation. Chief Legal Officer Sabrina officially resigned. Her new office was in Midtown Manhattan, small, but bright and spotless. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows lay the city's skyline. Sabrina stood in the doorway, looking at the nameplate. There was only one name above: Sabrina. She stood there, the corners of her mouth tipping up slightly. She was no longer Julian's wife. She was simply Sabrina. At 3 in the afternoon, the door was pushed open. Marcus walked in, a document in his hand. Sabrina. He set the paper on the desk. I need a partner. Sabrina looked down and glanced at the document. A partnership invitation. Her name was written in the partner column. She lifted her head and looked at Marcus. Partner? Her voice was soft, with a hint of amusement. I prefer an equal companion. Marcus smiled, too. Then it's settled. The two looked at each other, no flirtation, no promises, only a kind of tacit understanding. Two top-tier minds had finally found someone they could resonate with. Sabrina stood by the window, staring at the city's skyline. She remembered the basement from 6 years ago. Back then, she sat on a shabby chair, revising contracts line by line. Julian sat beside her writing code, occasionally looking up at her and smiling, "Thanks for your hard work, wife." At the time, she thought that was love. Now, she knew it had only been manipulation. But she did not regret it. Because those 6 years had made her who she was today. 6 years ago, for the sake of a promise, she willingly gave up her name and lived in anonymity. 6 years later, she finally understood, she didn't need anyone to put a name on her. She only needed to take back the name that belonged to her. And that name was Sabrina.